Alright, so the First Descendant just launched. It literally just went live. So today we'll be testing it with the RTX 4070 Super. That is paired with a 14600KF CPU, and that again is paired with DDR5 6400 mega transfers per second CL32 memory. Now there's a lot to go over here. I'm gonna try and make this quick, but if I do miss something, I will try and do a follow-up video. So let's just go through the settings here quickly. That's where there's a lot to digest. We've got a bunch of preset settings here. So we've got low, medium, high, ultra, auto, and custom. And then under additional options, you can actually select Nvidia, AMD, Intel, or Epic Games. So under Nvidia, we do have the DLSS and frame generation, reflex low latency, and ray reconstruction, right? So this game does support ray tracing and ray reconstruction, although ray reconstruction actually impacts performance negatively in this title. Anyway, so we'll just I just want to show you. So for AMD, we have FSR, not entirely sure which version, but we also have frame generation. So we do have FSR frame generation here, and then for Intel we only have XeSS, and then we've got Epic Games, which has TSR, right? So which is a temporal super resolution. All right, so we'll be sticking with the Nvidia. I'm on DLAA at the moment. VSync off, frame generation off, everything set to ultra, and ray tracing set to ultra as well. We're at 1080p, and the performance is not that great, but ray tracing is extremely heavy in this game. Now the game does become very CPU bound actually in certain areas. Like you can see there that our GPU usage is dropping below 90% at times, but I mean ray tracing is very demanding, and there's some enemies here for me to fight. So we're not able to maintain 60 frames per second to 1080p native with the 4070 Super, with everything set to ultra, including ray tracing. Like I did not even really do the tutorial, so pardon me for sucking in this game. I will be playing this game. It seems like a very fun game. I'll pay more attention to it when the time comes. Anyway, so this is just the baseline performance. We'll be moving a little bit quicker from here, and hopefully it goes a little bit better. Alright, so an average there of 60 frames per second, our 1% lows are sitting at 44, and our 0.1% lows are sitting at 36. 0.2% lows, sorry, this is cap frame X, so we only have access to 0.2% lows in the overlay. Right, so I'm just going to disable ray tracing. Remember, we had an average there of 60 frames per second. So now without ray tracing, let's see what happens. Now we are more in the 90s there. This is Unreal Engine 5, and it's apparent there is quite a few stutters, shader compilation stutters every now and again. Although there is a very not an extensive shader compilation step at the beginning, but the first time you boot up the game, there's a shader compilation step, and also when you go into the world map for the first time, there's also a small shader compilation step. Now, as we know from Unreal Engine 5, it does love upscaling, right? So not getting very consistent decent performance here. Sometimes we get 60 frames per second, sometimes we get 100 frames per second. So let's see what happens if we enable DLSS here. So previously we were just using DLAA, so let's just go with DLSS set to quality quickly. And in my previous testing at 1440p at least, we saw a very decent bump in the performance or in the frame rate. Remember, DLSS doesn't really increase your performance per se. Your GPU still is as powerful as it was. It's just now rendering internally at a lower resolution. So your GPU does not magically become more powerful. It's just easier to render internally at a lower resolution. And I am a little bit sick. I do have a bit of a cold. I'll just be testing in this small area here. And as you can see, we are still dropping into the 90s at times, even with DLSS set to quality. And I do believe we are sitting with a small CPU bottleneck at times, especially at 1080p. Although definitely not that much. If we look at the GPU busy average there, we're sitting at 8.9, and our frame time average is sitting at 9.1. So not really very CPU bottlenecked here. Alright, so an average there of 112 frames per second. Our 1% lows are sitting at 76, and our 0.2% lows are sitting at 64. Alright, so let's just see what happens if we enable frame generation here, and we had an average through of 112. Remember, now that goes up to a real-time frame rate of 170 at times. wow, okay, so frame generation in this game actually makes a very, very big difference. We are probably slightly CPU bound. If we look at our GPU power, it's sitting at 170 watt. We should be able to draw up to 220 watt with this GPU, so definitely something is holding us back, or maybe, I mean, maybe it's just the way it is. Maybe this is just how it goes. All right, so I know I said we want to test a little bit quicker, but as I said, there's a lot to go over. So let's just enable ray tracing once again and see if we actually do get playable frame rates here with the ray tracing. So we'll test everything at ultra 1080p. I mean, what's the point? So with ray tracing, DLSS, with frame generation, getting a high refresh rate experience, kind of depending on how you consider or what you consider a high refresh rate experience. The frame rate output is definitely high refresh rate, but the input latency is definitely not. All right, so the game actually does look pretty cool. I do like the way it looks. The character models do look a little bit soft, a little bit blurry, and I mean, it is what it is, right? The environments look pretty good. Ray tracing, I'm not entirely convinced about ray tracing just yet. Although we do get some decent reflections and shadows, or accurate reflections and shadows, I should say. Not entirely sure exactly what kind of ray tracing this game actually does support, but there we have it. Pretty high refresh rate experience here at 1080p, but typically you don't buy a 4070 Super to play at 1080p, so we'll be testing at 1440p next. Except I just want to drop this down to the high preset using these exact same settings. I just want to see what kind of gains we do get to the frame rate. So sitting here with 120 frames per second in this specific spot. I'm going to leave ray tracing at ultra and everything as is, just to make a comparison. So 120 frames per second in that specific spot. So we do get a pretty decent bump in our frame rate, or bump to our frame rate, when we enable the high preset instead of the ultra preset. And I do think the game still looks plenty good and on the high preset. So take that into consideration if you are planning to play this game. Now, this game is free on Steam, so if you want to try it out, there's literally no cost involved at all. It's a free to play game, and I think it looks kind of fun. Definitely up my alley. All right, so I think that's going to be it for 1080p. Let's move over to 1440p. All right, so 1440p, ultra, everything ultra, native resolution with DLAA and no frame generation. And this is not going to go so well. Let me just increase the numbers there slightly, the overlay. Hold on 1 second. All right, that's better. So let's reset our numbers quickly. And I mean, this is a fairly big hit to the performance. We basically, like, no, we actually did not halve our frame rate. At times we did. We were seeing around 60 to 70 frames per second at 1080p. We're using these exact same settings, and I leveled up. That's great. So, and now it's dropping into the 30s. So definitely not how you'd want to play this game, considering it's a pretty fast-paced shooter. And okay, so let's just leave these exact same settings, and I'll just enable DLSS quickly. Alright, so we just have DLSS quality and no frame generation. Oops, so let's just enable that. And lo and behold, now we are able to hit 60 frames per second. Now remember that ray tracing is set to ultra, yeah. Now, as I said earlier, I'm not entirely sure exactly what kind of ray tracing techniques this game utilizes, but I mean, it's definitely pretty heavy on the performance, yeah. So getting an average here of 67 frames per second, which is definitely not terrible, considering 1440p ultra, DLSS quality with ray tracing set to ultra as well. So let's go ahead and enable frame generation, yeah, see what it can do here for us. All right, so we just enabled frame generation. I'm going to enable ray reconstruction as well, just to show you the performance hit, which is kind of strange because generally there's no performance hit in other games that support it, or at least sometimes there's actually performance benefit or no performance hit at all. So looking at you, Cyberpunk. So now we're getting an average error, or not an average, a real-time frame rate error of 100 and just above 100 frames per second. Our frame time graph is quite smooth now, and this is actually pretty good. I mean, sure, we are now having a little bit of an additional input lag. Sorry, I'm really slurring my speech. As I said, I'm a little bit sick, so Going to try that again. We do have additional input latency here just from enabling frame generation. That's just how frame generation works, right? It's unfortunately it does increase your input latency slightly depending on your settings, of course. So generally, I try to aim for around 60 frames per second base frame rate before I enable frame generation. If you can hit 60 frames per second without using DLSS upscaling, even better, because then you can just enable DLSS upscaling. You'll move that 60 frames per second to 90 frames per second, and then you enable frame generation, and you'll have a pretty good time. All right, so I know I'm just running around shooting stuff, whatever, getting an average of 98 frames per second, but the input latency is actually, it's decent. It's seeing that it's PvE instead of PvP, I don't think the input latency would be an issue, especially for somebody like me anyway. Alright, so an average of 98 frames per second, our 1% lows are sitting at 72, and our 0.2% lows are sitting at 56. I have to get used to setting to 0.2% instead of 0.1%, but I do want to show the GPU busy. You can see that we are not CPU bound at all. Alright, so not entirely sure what kind of settings we want to test now. I think we just want to disable ray tracing. Actually, let's leave ray tracing on, and let's enable ray reconstruction, right? So just want to see, we are getting 105 frames per second standing still here, 105, 106. So the frame generation does not work in the menu, that's why the frame rate drops. Now if we enable ray reconstruction, you can see our base frame rate drops from 59 to 52. So, and if we go back into the game, that dropped from 105 to 97, which not sure why that is. It's not the biggest drop, it's like around 10%, but as I said, it is kind of unusual. Other games, well, especially Cyberpunk, I'm using Cyberpunk as an example here. I know Alan Wake 2 also has ray reconstruction, but anyway, this is just an observation compared to Cyberpunk, right? So if you do want cleaner reflections and stuff, that's typically where ray reconstruction helps a lot. Then you can use ray reconstruction, but I'm not entirely convinced that it's worth the performance. Ray tracing itself in this game might not be worth it to me personally, but that's up to each and everyone's personal preference, right? So let's go ahead and just enable or disable ray tracing here. Going to leave the exact same settings, frame generation on DLSS set to quality, and there we go, 130 frames per second. Let me just make sure we reset the numbers. All right, so ray tracing has around a 20% performance hit at this resolution using these settings, which is actually not that bad. I'm not sure if the recording will pick up the I'm not going to call it stuttering, but it's like a visual stutter. I think it's because I play this game online from South Africa. It seems to be kind of rubber banding all over the place for me anyway. I saw it earlier, then I had to restart the game and it was better, but it seems to have returned now. But anyway, there we have it, 128 frames per second, 1% lows are sitting at 98, and our 0.2% lows are sitting at 87. Now just a quick warning, if you do go into the hub, the main city, we do become CPU bound. There's a lot of people playing the game at the moment. It seems to be very popular. And in the hub areas, the performance is pretty bad. All right, so let's just enable ray tracing again and then drop this down to the medium preset. All right, so with ray tracing on in this specific spot, we're getting 110 frames per second. So then if we go ahead and disable or just drop this down to high, not medium. So let's go ahead and go back here. So we gained around 12 to 15 frames per second just by dropping down to the high preset, and the game actually feels a lot smoother now. It's crazy what the 10 frames per second additional can do, especially when you are using frame generation. I'll disable ray tracing now, and then I'll just disable frame generation as well, just so you can get an idea if you're not a big fan of frame generation. It's perfectly understandable if you don't want to use it. I'm just using it in my testing, and I'll test without it as well. The game does look pretty good, I'm going to say that, except for the character models, which do look kind of blurry at times. Actually, now it looks better than previously anyway. So let's go ahead and just disable ray tracing here, and then, or first let's just disable frame generation, right? And then we'll disable ray tracing. So now, without frame generation, just DLSS quality on the high preset with ray tracing set to ultra. we are getting 80 frames per second. So definitely playable. I think you'll be fine playing this game at 60 frames per second. Just because it's PvE, right? You don't unless you are extremely sweaty when it comes to PvE games. 60 frames per second should be fine. I personally prefer a high frame rate just because I do have a 165 hertz monitor. If you see 60 hertz in the display settings, it's because my PC is connected to a 4K 60 hertz capture card, and it'll display as a 60 hertz. Anyway, so that's why we don't test with the frame with VSync enabled. Okay, so let's disable ray tracing and see what kind of performance benefit we get. All right, so we were seeing around 80 frames per second previously. Now we are getting around 100 frames per second, so around 20 to 23% increase in our frame rate just by disabling ray tracing. Now you might have noticed that I only use ray tracing on ultra, and that's because it's not really that heavy. I mean, 25 frames per second, 100 frames per second is really not that bad for ultra ray tracing. It might, so let's just be clear, this is the first area of the world map. There might be other areas which are a lot more demanding. I'm just here to give you an idea, right? There hasn't been a lot of time to test the multiple other areas yet. All right, so I'm just going to enable frame generation here quickly. I know I'm all over the place with the settings, but it's because there really is a lot of settings to test here. Technically, this is probably how I'd play the game on the high preset, ray tracing disabled, DLSS quality with frame generation enabled. If I do play on this 4070 Super, which is actually my daily as well, we are getting, I mean, this is a pretty decent experience for me. We are getting 130 frames per second, and with G-Sync enabled, that'll be a perfect frame rate for my 165 hertz monitor. And responsiveness is pretty good, visuals are pretty good, and performance is pretty good, I'd say. Definitely better than some other Unreal Engine 5 games we've seen lately. Okay, so I think that's going to be it. One last test at 1440p. I'm going to leave the exact same settings and then just drop this down to the medium preset just to see what kind of frame rates we get. We were sitting with 136 frames per second there. Now we are getting 158, 160 frames per second. Okay, so just to show you that VSync is disabled, 175 frames per second looking at the ground. And we're still not CPU bound, which is, I mean, this is actually pretty good. Unreal Engine 5 is definitely a very visually demanding, and I'd say this is not a terrible preset to use, the medium preset. If you do want slightly better performance, then I mean, there you have it. It still looks good. The shadows seems to have a bigger or a nearer pop in. I did not really notice the shadow pop-in on the other presets, but it does seem like you can see that the shadow on that wall, it's non-existent, and as you get closer, the shadows start populating. All right, so there we have it. I think we're done here with the 1440p at the moment, an average here of 164 frames per second, which is perfect for a 165 Hz monitor. Our 1% lows at 117 and our 0.2% lows at 90. All right, let's move this over to 4K. All right, so here we are at 4K, and if we go into graphic settings, I don't think this is going to go well. Like I'm not going to enable ray tracing just yet. I'm going to leave DLSS set to quality, but I will disable frame generation. So ultra with DLSS set to quality at 4K. Let's see. Okay, actually not too terrible. I was expecting slightly worse. Now the game looks exceptional at 4K, especially on a 4K 27-inch monitor, the one that I'm using for my benchmark captures here. I mean, we're not maintaining 60 frames per second. We are dropping into the 40s, the low 40s, the high 30s even. So it's definitely not not maintaining 60 frames per second, obviously. And I'm not sure why I only have the one ability, but this is actually quite cool. You do have just cause type of grapples, and you can actually grapple towards the ground as well to to prevent falling from the falling to death. Although I do think I don't think you can actually fall to death in this game. This guy's quite aggro. Anyway, so not a very good experience here. So let's just see what we actually need to do with DLSS to get 60 frames per second. Yeah, I think let's just drop this down to balance and see how that scales. So it's 60 frames per second now, give or take, but it will not maintain it, especially with dropping into the 50s. It's definitely much better, and it's a very, very good looking game at these settings. We will probably need to use the high preset with DLSS set to balanced, and then we'll be able to maintain 60 frames per second. And then once we maintain 60 frames per second, I'll enable ray tracing. Let's see how that goes. All right, so let's just go ahead, and like my main aim here is to just get 60 frames per second here at 4K. So I'm going to leave DLSS set to balanced and graphics set to high, and we should be able to maintain 60 now. And I think it's a good start. Let's just see, this specific area over here seems to be a little bit more demanding once we run down here, and dropping into the high 60s. I mean, it should maintain 60 frames per second. Well, especially just in my testing scenario anyway. It might be different in other planets or other areas, and depending on what's happening on the screen. Anyway, so we are actually maintaining 60 frames per second, which is pretty good, yeah. And our 1% lows are sitting at 56, and our 0.2% lows are sitting at 47. So let's go ahead and enable ray tracing here quickly. And I don't think this is going to go well at all. And let's see, actually not as terrible as I was expecting. 60 frames per second. You can definitely see that the shadows and ambient occlusion seem to be better with ray tracing. I might be mistaken, maybe there's a time of day difference, but the shadows did seem to be a little bit more pronounced when I enabled ray tracing. I'm not very good with analyzing visual detail and stuff in my videos. I'm using OBS to capture all my stuff, so I've got a and then I run it on a 4K monitor, and so I do miss out on a lot of detail. I'm just here to check the performance, right? So we're not able to maintain 60 frames per second here, which is, I mean, it's understandable. It's a 4070 Super. I just want to see quickly what our memory looks like. So we are sitting at 8 gigabytes of VRAM used, which is actually not terrible at all. All right, so not able to maintain 60 frames per second. So if we go with the performance, remember performance is 1080p internal resolution, and you do start seeing diminishing returns. I'd say going to balanced, you'll probably see the biggest gains to your frame rate, and from there it's diminishing returns going to performance and ultra performance. That's just from my personal experience anyway, but it does seem like we are able to stay close to 60 frames per second at least, if that is your aim. All right, so let's just get rid of these guys, and then I'm going to level up, and then we are going to enable frame generation here quickly, just with these settings, just normal frame generation. And I mean, we are sitting with ultra ray tracing at 4K, so I mean, there we have it. And now we're getting 85 frames per second. It does feel kind of floaty because the input latency is slightly worse due to the base frame rate being slightly lower than at the previous resolutions, right? So I do think if you do play this game, maybe not use ray tracing at 4K with the 4070 Super. So let's just go ahead and disable ray tracing quickly. I'm just going to leave everything up there. So the base frame rate went from 49 to 61 in this, and then frame generation still needs to kick in, and now we're getting 100 and, well, around 100 frames per second. This is much better, and it's actually a very, very decent playable experience at I mean, I say 4K, but it's DLSS performance, so it's 1080p upscale to 4K. So, and still we are using around 8.5 gigabytes of VRAM, so I don't think we are running the risk of running out of VRAM here at all. So lastly, let's go ahead and just drop this down to the medium preset where we are. So medium preset, just want to see, we're getting around 100 frames per second, right? And now we're getting around 110, 100, well, 115, depending on the specific area here. And I do think that now we should be able to disable frame generation. And I mean, if you are aiming only for 60 frames per second, we should be able to disable frame generation and maybe use DLSS balanced, maybe even quality. So let's go ahead and do that right now. So first off, we'll just disable frame generation here. So frame generation off. So we were getting around 110 frames per second. Frame generation did very little for us. Did it actually disable? Let's just make sure frame generation is disabled. So it didn't really make a big difference for us. And this typically happens on more mid-range GPUs at 4K when you enable frame generation. The 4060, even at 1080p at times, frame generation does nothing. It's just the GPU runs out of horsepower to actually even generate frames. All right, so and that's where I do think that AMD's frame generation will actually help better, or help more. All right, so 100 frames per second here, which is actually pretty decent. So let's see if we can actually get a more decent image quality here. So let's go with DLSS quality. I think we should be fine. That's 60 frames per second. There we go. 86 frames per second DLSS quality on the medium preset at 4K. I think this is the way to go if you are playing on a 4K monitor with an RTX 4070 Super. The game looks pretty good at 4K, as I said. Even on the medium preset, it still looks plenty good. And without ray tracing, we are getting decent performance, and we're not having the input latency penalty coming from frame generation to actually get above 60 frames per second here. So something to consider. I personally would be playing with frame generation at 1440p, but at 4K, I do think that the medium preset and DLSS quality is actually the way to go. Let's just see if we can actually hit 60 frames per second without upscaling. I doubt it, because Unreal Engine 5 does like upscaling. And there we go. So there's a big difference just using upscaling. Remember, DLSS quality is 1440p at 4K. So and including a bit of overhead, right? Because we were definitely getting a much higher frame rate at 1440p medium. So just remember that DLSS does have a little bit of overhead, and you can't really get the same performance as you would have natively at the lower resolution. All right, so that's going to be it for this video. I think we covered all bases. I know that we didn't go through all the ray traced settings, but as I said, there's a lot, and I don't want this video to be too long. It's already quite long. So I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and as always, we hope to see you in the next one.